rather than in Harvard, and who in the autumn will be taking up a research post at Edinburgh University. And he's here to speak on Spartan militarism, power, slavery and agriculture, which is part of the work that he's been doing and will be doing in the next few years, as I understand it.
Yes.
Over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much for that kind of introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking Andy for the invitation to come and speak to you here tonight. Even though he is not here due to planning committee business, as I understand it. I'm not going to claim that what I have to say is more interesting than that, but I think it probably is. The part of what I'm going to speak to you about tonight is a couple of things. One thing is kind of the book that I've been writing about ancient Sparta, particularly from around 700 BC to around 323 BC, on the phenomenon of Spartan territory. I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And then the second is a general interest in the gulf that exists, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, between popular perceptions of what Sparta is, what it was like, what people were doing there, and what specialists like myself are interested in, and what we think it was like, and what we think it was about. And I think this is a conversation that increasingly is being had, but can always be had a bit more thoroughly and a bit better. I can't actually recall if when I gave Andy the title for tonight that I included the question mark in Spartan militarism. Normally a trick I pull for conferences is I'll put the question mark when I submit the paper, and I have the choice of either keeping it or getting rid of it when the conference comes around, because look, I made up my mind. But I want to kind of keep the question mark there tonight, because I think that Spartan militarism, it may come as a surprise to you, but I think it should be an aspect of Spartan society in ancient Sparta that we should question, right? I think in the popular perception of ancient Sparta, its military prowess, right, its ability to fight wars successfully is something that many would tend to want, right? You know, when we think of ancient Sparta, we think of it as an ancient Greek city-state that had a particularly famous army and was famous in ancient Greece for fighting in this way. But obviously, as I'll explain in a second, kind of a military and militarism are two ever so slightly different things. So just as kind of like a brief gambit, here we have two images from popular perceptions of Sparta. On the left, we have a film that as someone who teaches undergraduates for a living, I spend a great deal of my time talking about professionally. That is Zack Snyder's 2006 film 300, based on a kind of graphic novel by Frank Miller from the 90s. And then we have a still from the 1962 film, The 300 Spartans, which was a sort of swords and sandals rendition of the Battle of Thermopylae, one of the major battles of the Persian Wars fought in the early 5th century BC. Now, both films have the fact in common that they prioritise the contribution of the 300 Spartans, right? The 300 is something that I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of, even if only through cultural miasma or osmosis or whatever. This idea that a small force fought against a vast Persian army, Herodotus says an army of 20,000, and I don't have the wherewithal to tell you if that's the real number or not. And I think by doing that, what both films also have in common is something that is missing. So if you compare both films, right, they have a contingent of 300 Spartans and then a slightly larger contingent of Thespians. So just to kind of begin trying to tease out this tension, right, between ancient ideas and popular perceptions of ancient Sparta, these are the original trig numbers that Herodotus includes in Book 7, where he describes the Battle of Thermopylae. And essentially, we have small contingents from all over Greece. Right? We have 300 Spartans, as well as 700 Thespians, who are also included in both films. But then we have kind of lots of people from the Peloponnese. We have 500 Achaeans, 500 Mantineans, 120 from Orchomenus, so on and so forth. And the way the narrative of Book 5 of Book 7 of Herodotus' histories goes on is that at one point Leonidas, the king of Sparta, says to them, listen, we're all going to die here. If you don't be here, then you're very welcome to go, right? Because this is the way that Herodotus presents it. And so the majority of them leave. So we're left with 300 Spartiates, as well as their slave attendants, I'll get on to in a second, 700 Thespians and 500 Thebans. The 500 Thebans then latterly decide they do not want to die at the end of the battle, and so they desert to the Persians. So we're left with 300 Spartans, 300 of their slave attendants, the Helots, and then 700 Thespians. However, so that is one way that the kind of figure of kind of Spartan militarism and Spartan sacrifice is represented in our ancient Greek material. And the idea that Sparta is a society for which the kind of celebration of warfare and kind of military valour is an idea that is not without basis in the kind of texts left to us by the ancient Greeks. This text is from the 5th century historian Thucydides, the author of A History of the Peloponnesian War. And this is a passage taken from the Periclean funeral oration. This is the oration given by Pericles that Thucydides is putting into the mouth of Pericles in 430, following the first year of casualties in the war. And he makes this very strong contrast between the Athenian and the Spartan way of doing things. We, i.e. the Athenians, are different from our adversaries, the Spartans, or the Lacedaemonians, as they're also known, also in our military practices in the following ways. We throw open our city to the world and never, by expulsions of foreigners, exclude them from any opportunity of learning or observing, although the eyes of an enemy may occasionally profit by our liberality. Sparta is a closed society that is guarded about its military secrets per se, whereas Athens is not. Trusting less in preparations and deceits than to the native spirit of our citizens. Right? So we are also good soldiers, Pericles is saying, but our military prowess is inborn, whereas in Sparta they have to train to be good soldiers. While in education, where our rivals from their very cradles by a laborious discipline seek after manliness, Andrea in the Greek, can also mean bravery. In Athens we live exactly as we please, and yet are just as ready to face the perils which they face. So we're brilliant by accident, is Pericles' point here. And so what this is doing is drawing an ideological contrast between Athens as a society and Sparta on the one hand. Now, if we were then to use this as evidence to say Sparta was a militaristic society, then it would be quite difficult to do that because it's such a rhetorical context. Now, this is from the late 5th century. Similar passages appear in our evidence in the work of an orator and rhetorician called Socrates, who was writing in Athens in the mid-4th century. And these are, again, very charged kind of ideological passages where he is making something of this strong contrast between both cities. So this is from the Busiris, where he compares Sparta's government and practices to that of Egypt, using them to make the point that Egypt is a very peaceful society, but Sparta is a very warlike one, that they have borrowed similar practices of the Egyptians and used them for a warlike purpose, because that is the basis on which their society is structured. A similar passage appears in the Archidamus. This is a very interesting dialogue where Spartan prince is essentially, it's entirely a rhetorical exercise. It has nothing to do with real history. Essentially, a speech to the Spartans is put in the mouth of Archidamus, who is the son of one of the current kings, Agesilaus. And he's essentially trying to convince the Spartans to abandon their city and become a raging, ravaging army across all of Greece. And this is just to give you a sense of the rhetoric, where Isocrates uses this very famous image of Sparta, its constitution, its politeia, has established the city as a military camp. And this is a very, very powerful idea in kind of the history of the study of Sparta. And as I say, it is not without basis in kind of ways that ancient Greeks talked about ancient Sparta. It's just very hard to know how it relates to reality. So that's just to sort of kind of give you a sense of how the military ideal is built up in ancient Sparta. Some points to note about all of these texts. They are all written by Athenians, right? This is an external perspective on Sparta that does not necessarily reflect Spartan cultural attitudes and give us real knowledge about Sparta itself. They are all very rhetorically charged contexts, right? This is Thucydides claiming to remember or give a sense of what Pericles said in the first year of the war, likely writing about 25 years after the event, but potentially based on a historical utterance. The utterances of Isocrates are, to a certain extent, entirely fictitious, right? They are using historical material to come up with an interesting rhetorical dialogue. So as evidence of real history, it's not impossible to make use of this material, but in terms of evidence of Spartan society itself, it's quite difficult to make use of it. So moving on to sort of something of the lived reality of ancient Sparta, to give a sense of what kind of place we're talking about. Ancient Sparta is quite unusual in the sense that we have a pretty good understanding of its social structure. And broadly speaking, the inhabitants of the wider region that it controlled can be divided into these three categories. At the top, we have the Spartiates. These are the full citizens who participate in the centralised political institutions. They are eligible for elected office. They have full land ownership rights. They are also members of collective dining clubs that are sometimes referred to as messes in the literature, essentially kind of on the analogy of regimental messes in kind of modern armies, although the analogy isn't entirely without basis. They are all very wealthy, by and large. They own a lot of land, and they collect rent in the form of agricultural produce from these estates. A small point about terminology here, which I think makes the history of ancient Sparta very confusing. The term Spartan, commonly used in English, has no real equivalent in ancient Greek. The ancient Greek for Spartan is Lacedaemonios, which is often anglicised to Lacedaemonian. So Spartiate is sometimes translated as Spartan, but this is very confusing and very inaccurate, because when an ancient Greek author used that term, they intended to refer to these particular people, full Spartan citizens. So that is why I specified here Spartiates, because it's 300 Spartiates, or 300 Lacedaemonians, not 300 Spartans. Then we have these rather confusing people, the perioikoi. And these are also Lacedaemonians. They are referred to as such in our ancient literature. And perioikoi in Greek means dwellers around. Around what, you might ask? Well, here we have a map of, very roughly, don't assume too much by the hard border implied by the colour, a rough diagram of the historical territory of ancient Sparta. It controlled roughly the entirety of the southern Peloponnese, these two regions, Laconia in the east and Messenia in the west, Sparta here in the centre, and all of these other places that are quite obscure, and I would forgive you if none of you, forgive you if you've never heard of any of them. Githero, Las, Ithros, Devros, Lura. They are all perioikic cities. These are where non-Spartiate Lacedaemonians lived. Now you may ask me, Tom, have any of these places been thoroughly excavated so we have a detailed understanding of the daily lives of these people? Sadly the answer would be no. So perioiki are very obscure and a lot is not known about them. So, for example, we know, and I think, know isn't too strong a word here, we know that all of these non-Spartan settlements had their own government. They had their own ways of politically organising themselves. But we don't have any detailed information about them. Right? That is a supposition. It is a fair one, but it is a supposition. We do know that perioikoi served in the army quite fully, especially in the 5th and 4th centuries. This is a manpower resource on which the Spartans are very reliant. Throughout the 5th century, the Spartiate population is declining. The reasons for this aren't entirely clear, but it seems that a lot of it is not because fewer Spartiates are being born, it's because they're losing their citizenship rights. I'll get into why that is in a second. They are also referred to as Lacedaemonians. In fact, Herodotus refers to them as the other Lacedaemonians, the aloi Lacedaemonioi, who are not as good, but still fine. They are esi agathoi, right? So and that doesn't just mean good. That means good in sort of like a moral sense of the term. A lot of my work revolves around speculating in a very clever way, trust me, what these people are up to and what they're doing. But they are still one of the great unknowns of ancient Spartan history. And then finally we have the Helots. These are enslaved agricultural labour force who managed the estates of the absentee rentier Spartiates. They are directly owned by Spartiates, but the state, the polis, the city-state regulates certain aspects of their ownership. So you cannot privately free them, you cannot manumit them as an individual slaveholder. Only the polis can do that. And you cannot sell them outside of the boundaries of Spartan territory. So this is an agricultural labour force that the polis was very, very keen on keeping where they were. Right? And the reasons behind that are interesting. They are absolutely not Lacedaemonians, but they are Greek. Unlike other enslaved populations in ancient Greece, these are not individuals who have been purchased or kidnapped from Turkey or the Black Sea or other areas of the Eastern Mediterranean. They were enslaved in Greece itself originally. And again, how that process came about is very obscure, and I'm not going to bother speculating too much about it tonight because it would simply waste time. So this is sort of an architecture on which we can build other aspects of our understanding of Spartan history. One of the things that did make Sparta genuinely unique in Greek history, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about whether Sparta was an exceptional or a not exceptional polis, right? How different is it from other Greek cities? Something that did make it genuinely exceptional is the amount of territory that it controlled or claimed to control. and that's kind of the starting point for my whole research. This total landmass is around 8,500 square kilometres. So for comparison, most Greek cities controlled between 25 and 100 square kilometres. Athens controlled 2,500 square kilometres. So this is a large territory about which we have an imperfect understanding of how the Spartans maintained control over it with a relative level of stability for around 400 years, right, until 371. Because there are sort of plenty of reasons to think that they might have struggled to do so. Like pretty much all ancient states, ancient Sparta had quite limited institutional capacities, right? It doesn't have a big bureaucratic apparatus. It was a polis that relied very heavily on private resources and private wealth. It is famous for its army, but it does not have a standing army, right? Sometimes you might see people say things like the Spartans were all professional soldiers, and I'm going to get on to kind of how that is and is not true in a second, but like any other Greek city, they do not have a standing army, right? They do not have a permanent coercive apparatus. They have very poorly organised financial resources. Right? I will look at a couple of the texts that prove this in a second. They are heavily reliant on that enslaved labour, which obviously makes the social fabric very, very unstable. Right? The fear of a widespread slave revolt of the kind of sort that we see in Italy at various stages is something that the Spartans are scared of. Right? And then we also have kind of the uncertain incorporation of the Perioikoi. Now, people used to say that the Perioikoi were loyal kind of co-oppressors of the Helots, right? That obviously their cultural attitudes would have mirrored those of the Spartiates. I'm not so sure that's true. If we assume that there were kind of class inequalities and wealth inequalities within these various communities around the region, then I think we should assume a broad range of social and economic attitudes. That's not the main topic of this talk, so I can talk more about that later on. But we have every reason to think that there were solid grounds for thinking that Sparta might have struggled to control a territory of this size. Throughout the 5th and 4th centuries, it seems clear that they had a pretty badly administrated state. This is from King Archidamus in the speech that Thucydides gives him in Book 1 of the History of the Peloponnesian War. And this is when they're debating as to whether they should go to war or not. We have Archidamus, who is against the war, and Xenoclidas, who is in favour of it. And his speech is very short, and he says, "What are you talking about? The Spartans are great, we will win." And very interesting comment. How is it so easy to make war against the Athenians? What is it that gives us confidence to launch into this so unprepared? Is it our ships? Well, in this we are inferior. If we were to pursue this and arm ourselves in turn, then this would take time. What about our finances? In this we are even more inferior, since there is nothing in our common treasury, and we do not readily make contributions from our private resources. We're all very wealthy people, we want to keep our wealth. We do not want to put it into a common pot, because of course we all make contributions anyway when we need it. So why do we need to worry? Now you might say that this is just kind of propaganda on the part of Thucydides, that he's an Athenian, and of course he is going to make the Spartan king say something very critical of the structure of the Spartan state. Well, Aristotle, in the mid-4th century, says something very similar. The arrangements concerning the common finances of the Spartiates are also defective. There is nothing in the common treasury of the polis, yet they are still required to undertake large wars, and they are bad at paying their aesphoroi. For on account of the fact that the majority of the land is owned by the Spartiates, they do not scrutinise each other's aesphoroi. That's just a kind of Greek word for tax. It was a form of tax that was paid in various Greek cities. The result is the opposite of that intended by the lawgiver, Lycurgus. The polis is impoverished, and private citizens are lovers of money. So, you might now say that I haven't really mentioned militarism that much. Well, now I am. So I think when we think about kind of a militarist society, it doesn't, I was saying this before, as we arrived, that doesn't just mean has an army or is interested in making war, I think. It means something more, right? It means something like the majority of their cultural institutions and their society are geared towards war making and use war making as a model for everything, right? And I think that there are much more kind of theoretically complex understandings of militarism that I'm not really engaging with here. But I think it's easy to look at the history of the 20th century, and we have plenty of kind of modern regimes that do use war as a model for various things and various ways of seeing the world. Perhaps the question we should be asking ourselves is Sparta kind of solely interested in war as a way of seeing the world, right? Are all of their cultural attitudes driven by a desire for war making, right? It's not obvious to me that that was either a practical reality of ancient Sparta or something that was kind of necessarily the sole virtue that was driving ancient Sparta. I can talk a bit more about, I'm going to talk more about this later on. Now, this is sort of a revisionist view that has been pursued quite strongly by Stephen Hodkinson, modern historian of ancient Sparta, in a number of publications. Two articles, both very interesting, where he writes, essentially, and when he writes about representation of Spartan society, he is talking about kind of these texts and texts like them. And he writes, representations of Spartan society and military affairs by contemporary classical writers lend at best only partial and qualified support to modern ideas of the dominant military elements within Spartan society. The earliest classical commentators note Sparta's distinctive military characteristics, but depict them either as just one facet of her society or as stemming from Sparta's broader civic arrangements and ideology, right? A well-staffed, well-run military is just one thing amongst many other things. There is no sense that they exercised a pervasive influence over her society as a whole, and I think that final sentence is very much what we mean when we mean militarism. And in a latter publication, he's dealt with the idea that whether or not Spartiates were full-time professional soldiers, where he reaches a very similar conclusion, that this is kind of, they are professional soldiers in the sense that they are well organised, not in the sense that they devote a lot of time to military training and kind of practising military organisation. I'm going to show you some texts that demonstrate this point in a second, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it now. So what I want to do for the remainder of this talk is essentially test the validity of this view, right, where essentially Hodkinson is saying that there isn't really such a thing as Spartan militarism, right, that Sparta is no more or less interested in war and war making than any other Greek city, right? You may therefore want to argue that Greek cities were more militarist than we would like to imagine, or less so, right? So, thinking about kind of whether this kind of has a basis in Spartan society or not. So coming back to the question of territory, which I think is quite crucial for understanding all of this, right? Because if we think of this potential control of this very large territory being one of the big unsolved problems of Spartan history, we could argue that Sparta is a society and a polis forged in conquest. So by and large, we don't have any Greek voices from Sparta itself. The exception are the kind of fragments, the later quotations of this Spartan poet Tyrtaeus, who was writing at some time in the late 7th century BC or the early 6th century BC. The chronology is a little unclear. These are fragments in the sense that they only survive because they are quoted by later authors who thought it was interesting and so decided to quote it. Now, the conventional, sorry, I'm jumping around these slides a little. The conventional early chronology of Sparta refers to these things, the Messenian Wars, right, which was essentially a series of confrontations between Laconia and Messenia when Sparta took control of this large region to its west. The main impetus for this being that, it's not really shown on this map, but here there's a very fertile agricultural plain. So they were taking to control that agricultural land. Now, I don't really put too much stock in that chronology because it only gets detailed in authors writing almost 700 years after the events, right? So I accept as a fact that there were some sorts of confrontations between the Spartans and the Messenians, but other than that, I don't think there's too much point in speculating. However, it's clear that Tyrtaeus was writing at a time when Sparta was undergoing some period of conflict with Messenia, because his poems commemorate this. There's a very famous one: "To our king Theopompus, dear to the gods, with whom we captured spacious Messene, which is good to plough and good to plant. For 19 years the spearmen, fathers of our fathers, fought over it unceasingly, having steadfastness in their hearts. And then, in the 20th year, they, i.e. the Messenians, abandoned their rich farmlands before fleeing the high Ithamaean mountains." Ithome is a small hill, it's not really a mountain, in Messenia. That's what Tyrtaeus is referring to. So this is kind of a period when conflict and this large confrontation obviously has an effect on Spartan cultural attitudes, right? There is a reason that these are the sorts of poems that Tyrtaeus is composing. Now, most of these poems would actually have been sung in the symposium at drinking parties. They're not sung on right before the army goes into battle. They are sung at private drinking parties. So this is really telling us something about Spartan cultural attitudes rather than anything about their military practice. So I think in that sense it is very useful evidence. But we also have Tyrtaeus in a very interesting poem, essentially celebrating practical virtue, kind of practical military virtue. I won't bother reading it out, but he essentially produces this list of mythological figures who are famous for their strength, for their wealth, and he's essentially making the point that the poem carries on, that none of this matters if it isn't drawn towards a practical purpose, and that purpose should be war, right? It is the warrior's virtue that is that which we should be celebrating. And so people have used this as evidence to say that, well, it's here in black and white, right? This is the warrior ideal, this is prioritising all virtues as they should serve a military ethic, right? A military ethos. Now, one rejoinder is that the historical context of these verses is obviously having an effect on it, right? It's a snapshot from a very kind of brief moment in Spartan history, a very important one, but a very brief one that we can't necessarily use to write the history of Sparta for the next 400 years. And I think there's a certain level of truth to that. Obviously, these poems would be re-performed, so I think it's fair to say that these would remain an important aspect of Spartan culture. But obviously, whenever anything is re-performed, anything is re-read, it has a different emphasis and a different echo. And it's quite clear that at later stages in Spartan history, this dominance of the military ethic is not quite as pronounced. So this is a passage taken from the Constitution of the Spartans, written by Xenophon at some point in the mid-4th century. And he does refer quite a bit to the importance of military organisation in particular, some passages which we'll look at in a second. But he's also interested in the Spartan polis being constructed on a moral grounding that isn't purely military. So this is the preface. Once, when I was pondering the fact that Sparta, though it is amongst the most thinly populated polis in Greece, became the most powerful and famous, I wondered how this could have happened. However, once I studied the institutions of the Spartiates, I wondered no more. Indeed, I admire Lycurgus, who gave the Lacedaemonians the laws in obedience to which they were outstandingly successful, and I think he reached the utmost limits of wisdom. For it is not by imitating the other polis, but by adopting customs quite different from most, that he made his own native city eminently prosperous. Right? So there's nothing about war here. There's nothing about a military ethic. It is much more general language about this being a good city because it uses good virtues. And the Greek for wisdom there is Sophia. So it's no particular kind of emphasis on military wisdom or practical material. It is kind of quite firmly grounded in this quite generalised moral framework. We see this later on. Again, I won't bother reading out this passage, but we look at after a very long kind of section where he's been narrating various customs of ancient Sparta. A strange thing about this text is that he attributes all the laws he discusses to Lycurgus. He wants to present the idea that this is a social and political system that was essentially planned out in one go. This is something we see in other lawgivers. This was almost certainly not true, right? He's describing Sparta as it is in the mid-4th century, or the early 4th century, depending on who you ask, and presenting that as a sort of single rational activity. So there's a lot of ideological push and pull going on in this text. But he makes the point that how different Sparta is from other polis, and he says that it is not because they are good soldiers, it is because they have nothing to do with the acquisition of wealth, that they must only do things concerning activities that promoted the freedom of cities. Deliberately vague language on Xenophon's part, and we can talk perhaps about what that might possibly mean later on. If we look at other aspects of kind of Spartan culture, such as its material culture, then we can see that there is a kind of military ethic there and a military agenda, but not one that is particularly unusual in archaic Greece. If we look at this example, this is a kylix, a wine-drinking cup from 6th century Sparta. It is an example of what is known as Laconian black figure. This is painted with glaze before the vase is fired, and then it produces this picture. And this is a pretty standard archaic scene of probably Heracles wrestling the Cretan bull, one of the 9 labours. There's nothing particularly militaristic about this phase, and it would have been produced from around the time that Tyrtaeus was writing, and so there's nothing in its visual culture that points towards something that is specially concerned with warfare. Because this was illicitly purchased, probably, in New York in 1993. That's why it's in the Boston Fine Art Museum. So we know nothing about its provenance, really. Based on the fact that it's quite a complete example and the date of its acquisition, this was probably looted at some point from a grave in southern Italy, because a lot of Laconian pottery is moving into southern Italy in the kind of 6th century BC. So I've sort of been quite mean about the sort of militaristic idea within Spartan society. However, to suggest that kind of the Spartans were not skilled in warfare in some aspects would simply be wrong. And this is where we come on to the point about professionalism. Right? Now, when we talk about professional soldiers, we mean something quite distinct. We have someone who is paid full-time as a soldier, as their main vocation. We have kind of quite complex training regimes that are designed to improve one's activity as a soldier, because that is your main professional activity, and that will result in training with weaponry, training in various manoeuvres and procedures, etc., all the things that we think of modern armies doing. As a rule in ancient Greece, as one scholar recently put it, most soldiers are have-a-go soldiers, right? You are not professional, you hate the people that live in the next valley, and it's wonderful every summer to knock 7 bells out to each other with the hoplite armour that you haven't picked up until a year before. Now that is a deliberately flippant caricature, but there is a point there, that by and large, any army in ancient Greece falls well below the criteria that we would use to talk about professional soldiers. However, there are things that the Spartans were very good at that other Greeks thought they were very good at. Now this is from a very long description in that same dialogue, the constitution of the Spartans, that talks about their military organisation. Now, there isn't much evidence that the Spartans did a lot of military training, right? They didn't, for example, spend any time, as far as we are aware, practicing the use of weaponry, which we would consider, a pretty core element of any modern army, right? What they were good at was this thing, taxis, which means good order. That they were very good at getting into formation and staying there and knowing where to go when they were told. Because your average hoplite is not particularly effective, right? Your armour weighs between 30 and 40 pounds. When you have it all on, you can't really see. Your effectiveness for someone on the battlefield is defined entirely by the strength of the formation. Right? Once that formation collapses, you're immediately less effective. So the Spartans had a very clearly defined military organisation, and they may well have done some sort of practicing of particular formations. So we'll just go through this passage to get a clearer sense of this. So he talks about the various numbers of officers and how they were organised. But we have one kind of enomatia at the front, sometimes with 3, sometimes with 6. Most people think that the Laconian military formation is very complicated, but their belief is the exact opposite of the reality. The reason that Xenophon would feel the need to make such a comment like that is because he is describing something unfamiliar, right? That you all think this is very complicated, because it isn't like this in Mantinea, or in Athens, or in Thebes. It is like this in Sparta, and it's really very simple. And then he goes on to describe kind of how they go from being in a line of troops to being in a phalanx facing an enemy phalanx, so on and so forth. And he points out how easy this in fact is. He continues, what's difficult about it is that to learn how to fight equally effectively side by side with whoever is at hand, after the line has been thrown into disorder, so when the battle begins, right, is not an easy thing to learn, except for those brought up under the laws of Lycurgus. The Lacedaemonians easily carry out even those manoeuvres which Hoplomachoi, kind of more practiced soldiers, consider very difficult. For when they march in line, one enomatia naturally follows the other. When they are in this formation and a hostile phalanx appears in front of them, the word is passed to the enomatia to deploy into line to the phalanx, and the order is passed along the whole line essentially. So they don't just sort of fall apart in a big crowd, they know exactly what to do. And this is something that the Spartans did appear to be practiced at, and we have evidence of them doing it. This is from Thucydides' account of the first battle of Mantinea, which took place in 418 BC during the Peloponnesian War. where he describes a manoeuvre ordered by the King Agis, who was commanding the army on this occasion, where he gave orders for the whole army to go to the assistance of the part of their army that was in danger of defeat. One part of the line was breaking, and so what Agis ordered them to do was for the whole army to wheel round in order to assist them. Now this was something that would have been horrendously difficult for any Greek army to do. This is thousands of men all trying to move at the same time, and you're trying to communicate that through pipes and heralds and shouts. So this cannot have been achieved, many historians have said, and I agree with them, without some sort of practice, without some sort of awareness of these formations. Thucydides also emphasises Spartan discipline in warfare. The rout, so the enemy line broken, and running after them, was not hotly pursued, nor did the retreat extend to any great distance, because the Lacedaemonians fight their battles long and stubbornly, standing their ground until they rout their foes. But when they have routed them, their pursuits are brief and only for a little distance. Thucydides, in his final comment, very much sets this out as something that was a rule of Spartan warfare, but we know from other texts that this was not quite true. In another battle from 395 during the Corinthian War, we're told about I found it amusing, case when the Thebans rout the Spartans and chase after them, but they chase them too far, and then the Spartans rout them and chase them back, and around 200 of them are killed. So whenever kind of ancient authors present things as rules of warfare of ancient Greece, we need to treat them with a bit of a pinch of salt. So hopefully I've taken you through kind of some key elements of the kind of both kind of ideological sense of Spartan militarism and the barriers of that, and elements of kind of Spartan military ethic and practice, taxis, that are actually grounded in reality. Just some brief conclusions. Spartan military skill in warfare is not without basis in our sources. Indeed, I think it has a very sound basis. Such skill does not seem to amount to a widespread cultural militarism. Right? This is quite closely defined. And even if such militarism did exist, it's not clear it overcame Sparta's, I think, bureaucratic limitations. I hope that's been clear. I'll be very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just before we go into questions, it's our usual practice in these meetings to give the speaker a chance to regain his breath while we make some housekeeping announcements. But as this is the last talk of this season for the branch, there's very little to say at the moment. We will arrange an AGM of which members will be given notice in the next month or few weeks. And at that we will talk about the programme for next year, which as soon as we've been able to get people to agree to dates of coming, we will announce to members both by email and through our website. That having been said, have we some questions? Lily?
So, more than that, I have a comment really. So, all nations, ethnic groups, tribes, things that those who fight for the nation, for the tribe, for the ethnic group are brave and noble and honourable, and the ancestors as well. And in Greece too, we think that all these nations, let's say, these groups, like the Spartans, the Macedonians, the Athenians, they're all brave and wonderful and full of honour. So that's kind of normal. However, growing up in Greece and within the Greek culture, I remember the Spartans were regarded as actually less civilized than the Athenians, for example, that had this wonderful civilization with the arts and the theatre and the philosophy. The same as the Macedonians, you know, they were admired for a lot of things, not just for building an empire. But the Spartans were more backward, less civilized. So this wonderful myth around the Spartans being braver than the brave, I think is a modern look at Sparta. And fitting more with what we think of militarism now, rather than anything to do with antiquity.
Yes, I mean, you're entirely correct. The tension you describe is one that you can identify in a lot of different times and places where history of Sparta has been written about in the modern world. You'll know as well as I that Sparta was actually extremely important for the establishment of the modern Greek nation state from 1826 onwards. In fact, one of the reasons that the archaeology of Sparta is so difficult is because King Otto, or Otto, his name is, decided to build a town right on top of ancient Sparta. Because of course, I'm a German who's just arrived in Greece to be their king, because of course everyone needs a king. I'm going to build a town in ancient Sparta. I think, coming as I have from the American context, the way that Athens and Sparta traditionally was spoken about there kind of very much fits along the ideological lines that you've set out. Athens is America, it is the Republic, right? It is the archetypal democracy, and Sparta is the Soviet Union, right? It's strange, it's odd, it cannot possibly be thought about in a rational kind of way because it's so backward. So I think, you can identify that tension in lots of different times and places.
Before we have another question, if anybody who's watching the live stream online at the moment wants to ask one, we won't be able to hear you speak, but if you write in the comments, I'll certainly read that out for you. Julius.
I enjoyed that very much. Thank you. I suppose in the sort of popular, or certainly as I've apprehended it, in the popular image of Sparta, there is this notion of militarism, but there's also, you get this sense of a strong sort of asceticism. Is that, which I suppose might go along with it, is that also reflective of what society was like?
To an extent, yes. I think it's clear that, so the sort of people... So if we look at this example of the black figure that I showed you, this sort of decorated pottery that continues into Athens well into the 4th century stops being produced at around 520. And the type of pottery that is produced is something known as black gloss or black glaze, so very simple. And it seems that there was kind of, certainly look at the fragments of Critias, the Athenian kind of iconophile, he was very kind of keen on this idea that Spartans were required to live a very austere lifestyle. But that's not to say that there are elements of that is a bit of an ideological fiction. So something that was commonly believed in sort of like, early 20th century work on Sparta was that there was a ban on the use of gold and silver currency. That appears to be something that was only in place in the years after the Peloponnesian War, when, because of the defeat of Athens, there was a huge influx of gold and silver currency into Sparta. So it's a windfall that the polis is worried about regulating. And wealth was deployed in sort of very different ways. So a lot of wealthy Spartans were horse breeders, for example, and would have deployed their wealth in that way. So we do have very wealthy individuals that are, to a certain extent, living an ideologically fictitious, austere lifestyle. But that's not to suggest that there aren't ways that wealth can be permissibly deployed within that society, if that makes sense. Burial is another one where kind of it does appear that that was an austerity that was quite judiciously enforced. So the only Spartan gravestones that we have much evidence of are these so-called empolimoi inscriptions, which just means in war in Greek, and it'd be a personal name followed by the words in war. but there are only 7 of them in existence, so it's hard to base too much on that. Yes?
Did the Romans have anything to say about the Spartans?
Yes. By a lot of the inscriptions, so classical Sparta didn't produce much inscriptional evidence, but by the Roman period, Sparta was something of a theme park, I think. It was somewhere that Romans liked to visit a lot, and because it was one of the great sites of classical Greece, so Romans were very interested in going there. There were lots of Spartans who had Roman citizenship, and it appears to undergo something of a kind of cultural rejuvenation in the Augustan period. The idea of the great sacrifice of Thermopylae is also something that starts to be built up in Roman literature. So Seneca has a kind of long description of the kind of heroes of Thermopylae. So yeah, the Romans were very interested in Sparta and engaged with it in kind of lots of different ways.
But did they have any views on whether or not they were militaristic or?
I don't think so in the terms that we would understand it. I think that they obviously theirs kind of quite conditioned by their own obsession with militarism, and I think you could sort of you could have a similar debate about whether these criteria apply to ancient Rome. Obviously, the Romans were professional soldiers in the sense that you had a full-time standing army, but it's hard to know if they did much training of any sort. So I don't think they really kind of engaged with Sparta in the terms that I'm engaging with them now. I think they're more interested in them as a sign of the classical height of Greece, and sort of are kind of one aspect of this cultural anxiety that the Romans have, that they have no inborn culture of themselves, right? They're a sort of a military camp, if you like, and their culture is essentially Greek in its roots. No, they're qualified now.
We'll turn to Kirill now for a Bulgarian viewpoint.
Yes, my son was asked in school, can you name 2 Greek states apart from Athens and Sparta? He said, of course, Bulgaria and Turkey. Anyway, the Spartans and the sea.
Yes.
Do we know anything about that? Because going back to the Athenians being the sea power and the bearers of freedom, ergo America, Britain, etc., and Sparta being the land power, Germany, Russia, Soviet Union, etc., etc.
Yes.
But the Spartans do have a seaside, and of course Kythera, somehow they must have related. That seems to be the only big island. And also there is a Side down there.
Yes.
And there is a Side in Asia Minor, so I wonder.
Yes.
What do we know about the Spartans and the sea, and in particular, what is the place of Kythera in the Spartan world?
Yes, Kythera. One thing that I think is curious about ancient Sparta is that I have found no particular interest for the Archaic Classical period in long-distance trade in Sparta. This was not something that Spartan elites were particularly interested in investing their time and money in. I think the reason for this is that they are self-sufficient in their main staples. They have a lot of agricultural land, so they can grow plenty of food, and they have quite a lot of iron ore and other metal ore deposits. So for their core staples, they don't, and other kind of essential industrial resources, they don't have to import stuff. You're quite right that it is curious that Sparta has so much coastline, and yet it is generally thought of as a land power. There were lots of fictional stories of Spartan colonisation, where they were apparently going all over the Mediterranean in the Archaic period to found new colonies. It appears that most of these are in fact purely fictitious. Cicero occupies a very interesting position in the ways that the Spartans thought about their own territory. There's this saying by the ether Keele that is quoted by Herodotus, where Keele, I can't remember the exact wording, I'm paraphrasing, but Keele said that it was so troublesome that it would be better to sink into the sea. Thucydides tells us that it was used as a base for pirates, which makes perfect sense considering the fact that Sparta lies on the three fingers of the Peloponnese, Malia, Manni, and Messenia, lie on the main sea routes to Crete and to Asia Minor and to the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean. So, whatever you think piracy is, that was going on. And actually, the Athenians did a lot of coastal raiding from the mid-5th century onwards. One of the reasons that I don't think a maritime Sparta, which obviously existed, isn't so pronounced is because they're all periodic communities. And we have very little information about the internal life of these communities, but obviously these people have been off the coast. Obviously these people are fishermen. And there's a project being done by a PhD student at Sao Paulo, which is tracing in detail the history of the coastline of Malia, the far eastern peninsula. So, Kent, sorry. Your question is very pronounced, but sadly, it is anything like detailed archaeological work that will learn any more about the lives of these coastal communities, because we don't have much literary evidence or any real inscriptions that tell us about the internal lives of these communities. It is quite clear that ideologically the Spartans are very land-based. It does seem to be the case that at the start of the Peloponnesian War they have not built up their navy because they do not think it is important. But that is only kind of a fact of the core elite, not everybody living within this very large macro region.
The pirates you mentioned in Cicero, how would they relate to Sparta? I mean, would they be against Sparta, or they would be pirating for Sparta?
Yeah, they're just being troublesome. There's a real. I don't work on history of maritime matters, right? Amongst people who study maritime Greece, what you think piracy is a real issue. Because sometimes it can just mean people coming from another Greek city to raid your city. So piracy, I think, is a very ideologically charged term. Essentially, it just refers to maritime activity to which you take exception. Which essentially is how the British Empire defined piracy, and various maritime powers that regulate maritime activity have done so throughout history. Thucydides doesn't really tell us anything about these pirates. He just says that it is an island that is known for piracy, and he just uses the normal Greek term for it. So they could be. I mean, I think people suggested they might be coming from Crete. Makes sense. Odysseus says that he, describes them, makes it this disguise as a Cretan pirate. So could be from anywhere.
Are there any other questions, including anybody want to come back if there's no new ones?
No, but could you come back and talk to us about the Odyssey? You just talked about the pirates and the trip, that lasted years, and he comes into contact with many different islanders and cultures, and that's so exciting.
Yes.
Please come back and talk to us about that.
I'm not an expert on colonisation, sadly.
Can I raise with you something that you and Andy Veer were talking about a couple of hours ago? Correct me if I misheard, because it was between the two of you. He was raising the question of, is there any evidence that the Spartan nobility, who couldn't engage in trade, etc., used agents from Perioikoi, or even, I suppose, some of their helots, to act as agents on their behalf in the way that, as he said, Roman senators couldn't sully their hands with filthy lucre, but they used their freedmen to run businesses on their behalf.
Yes, so I think, I was talking earlier about how the incorporation of the periodicals and the great unknowns of Spartan history. Another thing is how they related to these two other groups, right? One conventional interpretation is that obviously they were unswervingly loyal to the Spartans. That is, some of them surely were, but why do we think that all of them were? Right? There were class divisions within this group. These were communities that were about as unequal as any other Greek city. So, for example, I think that there might have been quite extensive patronage networks between the very wealthy Spartiates and the less wealthy periodicals. I think also there would have been various other, I mean, this is a longer argument I can make, but I don't think it's time, but for example, the Helots are the core agricultural labour force, right? And all Spartiates owned some, but they did not own, we think, the same amount amongst them, right? So some people, at the high points of the agricultural year, where you need to harvest or thresh, will quite easily have those labour requirements within their larger household, some won't. So they might have to rely on the wage labour of kind of poorer periodically, right, who don't have any land and have to somehow make a living. The coexistence of enslaved and wage labour is something that was absolutely the norm in ancient Greece. We have inscriptions from classical Athens which show records of men who were paid to make column flutes. These are the little ridges that appear in columns, and this was the last thing you did when you were building a temple, and we have a mixture of enslaved and free people being paid to do this. So the fact that that type of labour coexists is absolutely something we have evidence of. So I think there's a whole range of interactions between these various groups that can only really be drilled down into through quite careful and quite head-banging argument, which I'm doing so you don't have to. And then you can tell me more.
Just one last thing about the role of women in that kind of society, because I remember the way it was presented to us at school was that the women did some things similar to what men were doing, which was quite poorly for ancient Greek cultures that had women have a particular role in society, and that was a little bit blurred in Sparta. Is that correct?
So I think that if you place the role of Spartan women is something else that is kind of part of the modern morale of ancient Sparta. So if we look at how liberated the position of women was in various Greek cities, we can place it on a spectrum. In Athens, it was particularly conservative, right? Women could not own any property in their own right, whereas in Sparta, they could. Similarly, in the Cretan polis of Gortin, where we have quite detailed legal regulations of that time, it's quite easy to overstate it. There are certain things that were culturally acceptable in Sparta, such as the kind of gymnastic exercise for women that would have been culturally completely unacceptable in Athens, but it's all on a spectrum that is ultimately still quite misogynist. It's easy to overstate it, but there certainly are kind of identifiable cultural differences.
What sort of archaeological remains are there in Sparta?
Sparta itself, very little, because, as I said earlier, most of the modern town is built on top of the ancient town. The main, if you go to the Spartan Acropolis, then you would see the remains of a Roman theatre, the remains of a Byzantine circuit wall, the remains of several Byzantine churches, and the remains of aspects of a Roman settlement. Very little of the classical sanctuaries that were there. In the wider region, the main thing that has been excavated is sanctuaries. And that obviously biases the way we look at the region, because we find certain things at sanctuaries that we wouldn't find in other places. For example, our understanding of domestic archaeology in Laconia and Messenia is quite poor, simply because there hasn't been much excavation of settlements in that region. and what has been excavated hasn't always been fully published. So it's quite difficult to access. It's all in kind of Greek archaeological reports and stuff like that.
Keele?
Has there been any excavation of Kythera as a periodic city?
Yeah, there have been quite a few archaeological surveys of Kythera by British, Greek and Australian teams. But the archaeology of Kythera is very interesting because it was most of the investigation of it has been from the prehistoric period. And there has kind of been restudy of that material, but the evidence that has been produced hasn't necessarily provided convincing answers to the kind of questions that we might have about this karaoke community. But there's always scope for that material to be re-examined. I think the last publication of stuff in Keele was in 2013, and what of it was Hellenistic pottery, which had been excavated in the 60s. By a British excavation. I'm recalling those details imperfectly, but if you write to me, I'll sort of send them on.
You said that basically what we know about Sparta is from other people, not from the Spartans. Clearly, either they didn't record very much, or write very much, or inscribe very much, or it's got lost, or a bit of both. I don't know. What's your... I just wonder why, obviously Athens is the place that everyone knows about, because so much, I know it's not huge amounts, but relatively speaking, so much still exists, whereas other places it's quite small, isn't it?
Yeah. Some of it is geographical determinism.
Right.
What is the main stone to write inscriptions on in Athens? It is Pentelic marble. It is beautiful. It is white. You can paint it very nicely. It holds an inscription very nicely. And once you have done that, what else is that inscription useful for? To build something, right? Other than that, it is useless. What is the main stone in Sparta? Limestone. And what was Sparta used for hundreds of years? A lime quarry. So that is where I think a lot of Spartan inscriptions disappeared. I think it is also true that there wasn't a great valuing of the production of public documents in Sparta. I think that is true. A few years ago they found a lot of bronze tablets in Argos, so north of Sparta. And for years I was keen on the idea that there must be some kind of metal tablets that the Spartans wrote on. But I have now persuaded myself of that idea. I don't think I'm going to find anything. And generally speaking, in the work done by the Greek Archaeological Service and other excavations ongoing in the region, they haven't found much epigraphy. So I think that it is a bit of both. Many Spartan inscriptions did disappear, but they also weren't particularly interested in making them.
Yes, Richard the Younger.
So I don't really know too much about Sparta in general. Could you just briefly outline how Sparta began and how it eventually fell?
How long have you got?
Okay, I'm in your youth. And so Sparta kind of, as a kind of regional power, probably emerges at some point in 800 BC. Right, that's when the sanctuaries that I just referred to, people start putting stuff there. As a sort of kind of regional leader, it's really difficult because all of the kind of evidence that talks about early conquests in Sparta is written perhaps almost 700 years after the events they're allegedly describing. So at some point in its history, it becomes too difficult to dislodge Sparta from its regional position. When we get into sort of like the 5th century, we get narrative from Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon, and they talk about more of the kind of political moving and shaking that allows us to construct something of a reliable narrative of its history. The key cut-off point is kind of essentially after the Peloponnesian War, when Sparta lose a battle called the Battle of Leuctra to the Thebans. Leuctra is not on this map, but it is somewhere here. And this essentially is when they are dislodged from their regional hegemony. And after that, they become a bit of a Peloponnesian basket case. Now, that is a massive simplification, and the sort of, certainly the earliest stages in the 8th and 7th centuries, we don't really know what's going on. It may be that the idea that it emerged regionally as a kind of conquest state is just something that we're projecting into the past from unreliable later literary evidence. For example, one of the earliest sanctuaries is called the Anikleon. It's a sanctuary to Apollo, somewhere here. That is a regional gathering place where people are putting votives and gathering and feasting from around 1000 BC. So when we talk about Sparta, I think we're probably talking about lots of different kind of regional powers and agglomerations that it's very difficult to reconstruct the history of. But I can recommend some books to give you a fuller answer. Thank you.
What about Menelaus and Homer?
They worshipped Menelaus as a god. The picture I began with is called the Menelaio, where Helen and Menelaus were honoured as gods, and this is totally unique in the Greek world. There is also an Agamemnon in Mycenae, but it is a weird Peloponnesian quirk that these Homeric figures are honoured as gods. But how that fitted in with other kind of myths of Spartan territorial origins is unclear.
You didn't expect that answer.
No, the picture was.
Anyone else? Or have we done?
Sorry.
No.
What was the attitude of other Greeks towards the way Spartans spoke? Were they the butt of jokes?
Yeah. So I think that the main evidence for this is when Aristophanes includes chunks of Spartan dialect. Which say, for example, Athenian Greek theos, God, is written by kind of Aristophanes in the words of Spartan as Sios. And people used to think that, he must be playing this for laughs, right? Whereas then there was a book published in 1999 by Stephen Colvin about dialect in Aristophanes. And he argued that, no, not really, that the comedy's coming from elsewhere. Spartan rhetoric, in terms of being very brief and very blunt, absolutely is something that the Spartans are known for and occasionally made fun of for. I showed you a chunk from too many slides from Archidamus' speech in Book 1. That's about, I think if I remember correctly, 10 chapters of Thucydides, whereas the Slidas' speech, which is the pro-war speech, is 1. So this idea that Spartans speak very briefly and very clearly is absolutely something that other Greeks kind of thought to be particularly Spartan. As well as this element of there's a later collection called the Sayings of the Spartans that are collected by Plutarchs, and they're all kind of very gnomic utterances attributed to famous Spartans. But because we're in the Hellenistic period now, that's maybe less uniquely Spartan, because there's this wider phenomenon of kind of gnomic literature, where you collect together clever and famous things that people have said. Yeah.
Are we done? Well, let's just thank Tom again in our normal manner, and thank you so much for coming and covering such a wide field.
Thank you very much.